I feel like I'm going to start singing like you can't forget it.
Yeah, that.
I'm not going to. Cool. All right. Welcome everyone. Tomorrow is World Product Day, which is a very exciting thing for us all in the product world. And we are the first, we reckon, there is product meetups going on around the world, probably tomorrow. But because of that time, so etc. We reckon we're the best. We're a day early. So we're a day early. Auckland's doing it tomorrow, so we beat them. Yeah. Nice. So a very warm welcome to you all. We have amazing presenters tonight, which I'm very excited about. So to introduce who we've got, we have Fran Gleisner. So I remember being always late to meetings when we worked together at Xero because we would get stuck in the kitchen talking about product problems, how to get more people through bank rec, all of the data involved. We always got very quickly deep into product problems, which is, definitely a testament to your curiosity about the product world. And the co-host of Product Journeys, Lachlan Robertson, who I'm very privileged to get to spend every day with at work on product stuff. Solving product problems is absolutely Lockie's world. And if there's a really hard problem, he's got to go to. Cool. Take it away, team. Really excited to hear about everything about how to podcast.
So we're going to mishmash. Is it? Cool. Okay. Well, firstly, we've got a few questions. So how many of you have heard of Product Journeys podcast? Can you raise your hand? Cool. Right. How many of you have listened to at least one episode? And how many have listened to more than one episode? Cool. Okay. Just like that's one of our questions we've had for a long time.
So for those of you who have listened, some of these questions might be familiar to you. But one of our go-tos is to ask product people, if you're at a barbecue with someone, how do you describe what you do as a product person? Because we've found that's actually quite difficult for a lot of people to break down what a product person or a product manager is.
Yeah, and then also have you got a go-to product framework and what is it? It's another one that we've asked. And then the first question is always, how did you get to where you are today? Which is kind of interesting. And that's really where we get into beginnings of the journeys and dive in. And
then obviously exploring what next steps might be in people's product career. And that sort of paints the picture for Product Journeys as a podcast. The whole idea for us is to go and talk to a bunch of product people about their journeys, their experiences, and what they've learned throughout their careers. So that's us. I'm Lockie. I've been a product manager for now coming up on, I think, 4 years. I started at Xero. That was my first product gig. Before that, I was an engineer, but stumbled into being a product person because I was really curious about solving problems and just really enjoyed the idea of understanding why we're actually building something as opposed to the what behind what we're doing. So I was working at Xero. That's how I met Fran, and since then have transitioned across to Flick.
Cool. Yeah, and I'm Fran, and I have worked at Xero for just over 3 years, and it's probably my main product role. I moved back with COVID from the UK, and so Xero is really my first big product role, which is awesome, and that's where we met. Community of practice. I guess had an idea to do a podcast, and Lockie was like, "I'll do it with you," which was awesome. So today we're going to share more about how we got started, how we've actually applied product thinking to how we kind of developed this podcast, some learnings that we've had along the way, and hopefully some of our gems or things that we've found impactful from doing this. So we hope that, I guess by the end of this talk, we want you to kind of take away that you can actually apply product thinking to kind of anything you do. And if you've got an idea that you're dreaming about or thinking about, just go and do it, because you'll see that we basically started from nothing and have now come to where we are. So
and often the best way to learn is to actually do. So that's what we're trying to do. For the rest of the talk, we're going to use a product framework that we may have commandeered from one of our workplaces. But essentially, we're going to just walk through a cycle of how you might think about developing a product. There will be some loops in this. It's not always a linear process. But we're going to start by understanding the problem space, what we thought was the problem area and how we thought we could solve it. Then defining our solution around how we actually tried to meet that problem. Then how we iterated, further developed that. Finally, I guess the delivery and some of the experiments that we had to further prove out that idea. And then finally, just talking about how we're going to nurture that and continue to grow it in the future. So that's our context for the talk today. But we'll dive into the first space, which is understanding the problem space. The thing that we worked out as product people, and as I mentioned, we started at zero. We were both product owners at the time. Was basically trying to work out what A, product was, but also B, where we could go in our product careers, and things like developing to the next level to get either promoted or maybe one day end up being like a chief product officer, as an example. What are the things that we would need to do to actually get there? And in the community of practice that we were in, a lot of us had the similar questions. So we decided, well, why don't we just go talk to people who are already at these stages and try and learn from them? So that was kind of the genesis of the idea. And the other really interesting thing that we came across through our community practice was not just those that were already on the product journey, but even people that hadn't started it yet. So maybe they were trying to work out how to get into product. And essentially, we wanted to look at humanizing basically the journey that someone goes through in their product career and the mess that they go through to get to different places. And maybe they even come in at the top end of the funnel and start being a product officer from another place. So that's kind of the problem space that we're playing in. Essentially, from there, we just started talking to people, and then the podcast was born.
Yeah, and we started here, and we were sort of talking to people just in here mostly, which was a good starting point for us anyway. So we've got this problem that we thought, maybe it's interesting to try and solve it. So we thought about it in a bit of an MVP style in terms of actually like the software and like how we went through that. So as I said, initially we started at zero. We were internal, and so we started with free software, which was always a great starting point because we had no idea whether this was going to fly. So I guess the process, really briefly, we had a list of people that we thought would be quite cool to talk to within Xero. We went out and asked them. I think almost all of them said yes. Maybe a couple were like, no, don't have time. We recorded on a Google Meet, so we set up an hour session, and then we went away and edited it, and then cut it right down to 30 minutes was our aim. Took it back to them and said, "Are you happy with that?" They're like, "Yep," or tweak this, tweak that, and then we'd send it out, and it was all mostly done over Slack. So that was like the very first kind of cut, and then we pretty quickly realized that firstly, the quality bar is really important. So it's got to be enjoyable to listen to. So that requires quite a lot of editing, and editing is really hard. So the next step was to invest in some editing software. So if anybody wants to edit anything like this with like video, audio, Descript is awesome. Actually, this is a really sales pitch, but this changed, I think, my life. It's very cool. And we also invested in mics. Weirdly, both of our teams gifted us mics, which was very cool. So this is one of them. And that also raises the bar of quality as well. So it made a big difference having that just in the recording as well, even on Google Meets, which is quite cool. Then we were getting some interest, so people were starting to listen. We had obviously sort of guests lined up saying yes. So we were like, well, this is interesting, actually. We're enjoying it, but also obviously other people are enjoying it as well. And so that was kind of the next stage, was that people found it quite hard to listen to. And we thought, well, what are platforms that we might be able to use to make it easy to listen to? Things like Spotify or Apple Podcasts. That's where people mostly go to get their podcasts. So we thought, well, maybe we should think about going, and hosting externally. And so the next step was to invest in a hosting platform, which is sort of something where you can upload an episode, and the free one didn't have any analytics, and it didn't have any kind of information on like who's listening and how they're listening. So the platform hosting that we invested in allowed us to see that. So we used Omni, and then we could ship it out externally. So we kind of, at each step, we're trying to work out what was needed, what we were hearing from the people who are listening, and what were going to help us in this process as well. So that was kind of the way that we went through the MVP. And I'm going to hand over to Lauchie to talk about the content iterations that we did.
Yeah, and so MVP, by the end of that, we validated the fact that people were interested, did want to listen, which was great. But then we wanted to refine what was actually in the episodes. So we started very bare bones with this. It was literally a set of strict questions that we sent out, and we worked through each episode. We did a pretty quick introduction on Google Meet, and then we finished with some rapid fire questions, which that continues for the rest of it. I think is a crowd favorite for some people. So that's great. But yeah, essentially at the start, we started releasing this every 2 weeks because, as Fran mentioned, the quality pillar was really important. We also wanted to have consistency when we were doing this, so people knew what they could expect when they were sending these episodes out. But yeah, very, very strict questions that we worked through, and that was great for just a starting point. We then from there spiced it up a little bit with some intro music because that's what all pro podcasters use. So we're like, yeah, let's get amongst that. And then started looking at, as Fran mentioned, the streaming platforms and how do we get it out to the wider world. And part of this started the question around, we were just internal at Xero. How did we want to, I guess, go externally, and it started raising questions around things like our brand, and we had to think about what would this look like, because for our Slack things, I think it was just the Xero product podcast or something that we called it, which was super original, but we wanted to expand it a little bit to be talking about, as we said at the start, like people's product journeys. So that was kind of the brand or the idea that we settled on. And I guess I should point out the top here, that was about episode 10-ish we started through. And part of the process of going externally as well, we'd already had a bunch of episodes that were recorded. We needed to re-edit some of those because a few of them had a bit too much Xero sensitive information inside it. So we needed to do some re-editing. But essentially that meant from there we were external. And then, yeah, we started thinking about, again, the content, iterating on things. I guess you could think about these as features if you're thinking of a typical product world. But we started trying things like short teasers at the start of the episodes just to try and draw people in, because we know for the start of an episode, it's really important that you actually capture people's attention. So we experimented with some stuff in that space. And we also started posting on LinkedIn to get people to share. And I guess we worked out pretty quickly that when people shared, especially with their networks, that was great for listenership and people coming in. So that was another iteration on our content. And then we started playing around with some more fun little video clips for our socials. So we could have, again, sort of those short teasers, but just in video format to play around with whether people would want to listen to that some more. And some of them, a lot of people listen to those, and others less so. And then I guess the other important change that we sort of worked through. So the early phases of the podcast were very, I guess, rigid is probably a way you describe it. The questions were very deliberate when we worked through them, but through the conversations that Fran and I were having, we actually preferred the much more loose and casual style of actually just going where the conversation went. So we had an idea generally around what we were trying to get out of talking about people's product journeys, what they'd learn, but pretty quickly we just evolved through the flow and the chemistry that we developed through the now up to 30-ish episodes, that we just sort of were vibing and bouncing off each other and just following where the interesting parts of the conversation go. So that was, I guess, a key content iteration. And then our last thing that we experimented with, we got some feedback along the way that people really enjoyed hearing more about us. And in particular, one of the things we tried with that was adding some reflections at the end of the episodes to basically play back what we took away from our speakers and the things that we learn, and essentially how did that resonate with us for our jobs as product people. And we also added some guest photos into our episodes, essentially, so when you see them on the platform, you actually have an idea of who's talking for most of it. So that's essentially the iterations through the content. And as you can tell, we mostly added things, but hopefully it was for the better. But Fran, you can talk about the next bit.
Cool. Yeah. So in terms of obviously delivering, we've developed it, and now we're delivering, and as part of delivering, you want to track progress. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the metrics that were pretty interesting, and then experiments. So I guess Lauchie just covered things that we were kind of adding on. We also tried a whole bunch of things that were like one-offs that I would say they flopped. A few of them worked quite well, but most of them didn't actually. So we didn't continue them, or we sort of tried them and then we're like, nope. So in terms of metrics, as I said before, like, yeah, investing in a hosting platform was awesome because we got some pretty cool data. So altogether, we did 42 episodes, or published 42 episodes. We had a couple extra that we didn't end up publishing. The episode that's streamed the most had 194 streams. We were listened to in over 32 countries. I think the weird ones were Uganda, Vietnam, Jordan, which is a bit of a surprise, but you can see the map there, which is quite cool. So yeah, and New Zealand, 79% of listeners come from, so that's obviously our main target market, which makes sense. In terms of editing, I think almost every episode we edited out about 100 ums and ahs, including our own, but quite a lot of our guests. And it's quite interesting the listening back. I think it took me about 4 episodes before I got used to my own voice. That was quite good. And then the other interesting thing is average time spent listening is about 20 minutes across episodes. So we definitely, I'm the colour, and I used to go and cull it out. So we'd record for an hour, cut it down to half an hour, and then actually, only sort of near the end we realised that people were only spending about 20 minutes listening. So maybe that's something for the future. Then in terms of experiments, these were really, I guess, to find our point of difference, and ultimately we were trying to increase listeners. I guess at the beginning we went up quite a lot, and then we plateaued probably about halfway through. One of the things that we tried after a conversation with Tokes actually at ProductTank conference last year was we were talking quite a lot about products, but not really about Aotearoa or the fact that we work in New Zealand, but a lot of the content comes from overseas, like the US, or is tailored there, and really thinking about like maybe a point of difference is that, you know, how can we think about product in New Zealand? So we tried a few episodes where we the theme was very focused on New Zealand. Actually, they weren't great. We didn't get as many listeners, which was kind of interesting. You might find that interesting, Toads. Yeah. And I don't know, I mean, who knows why, but no, not at all. We also tried a two-part episode. So as I said, we tried to cut it down to half an hour. I think one, I was like, oh, it's too interesting. Let's just give like a 2-part episode a go. So publish 1 part and then another one a week later. That also didn't work. Obviously, people like listening to something all together. Lauchie had a more personal story about his redundancy. So that was one where obviously people had said, oh, we want to hear more about you guys. And so we thought, okay, let's do this. It was like top of mind. And that one went really well. So that was a learning that obviously we'll take as a good thing. The social clips, so we talked about posting like little video clips, so that you can do through the editing software. It takes a bit of time, but we thought we see it a lot on LinkedIn and socials. Didn't make a big difference actually. Like, you know, even the likes on LinkedIn and things like that, or shares, didn't really make a big difference. Reruns of episodes is also, I mean, I think sometimes we came to a week we were like, oh no. So what are we going to do? Let's rerun an episode. And yeah, that went okay, but it wasn't particularly good, but it's a good filler. And then we did a joint episode where we had 2 guests. So this was with Nicole and Sue from Trade Me. And that was really fun. And I think that worked quite well, but it was quite hard to edit. So that was an interesting, yeah, it was really nice to do. And I think we thought about doing a panel or something at some point, and this was our attempt at a panel. So, and then another question that I just had on the end in terms of thinking about the Aotearoa ones was, we definitely tried to get a hook with the title, and that was really hard. And I'm still curious as to whether that makes a difference or not. You know, reading a title, I do think it does, but I don't have any data on that at all. So kind of interested in people's thoughts afterwards, maybe.
Yeah. So yeah, we've obviously covered a lot of the life cycle that we walked through, but now we kind of just want to have a little bit of a chat just around essentially the key learnings, some of the challenges that we faced along the way, and then talk a little bit more about the future and what's next for the podcast. So this will be less slides and not just us talking. But the learning stuff for us throughout the whole thing, having great conversations with product people was really both enjoyable, rewarding, certainly for us as far as our own development, like great. The amount of gems and like things that we took away from them was well worth it. So if you haven't listened to them all, there's some great things in there. But for us, it was also just like having those conversations and meeting a great bunch of product people throughout New Zealand was super awesome. So that was certainly a reinforcing of a thing that we had from the start. The other, I guess, interesting learning or thing that we picked up throughout the process, initially, as I mentioned, our interviews were pretty strict as far as like the questions and the flow of the stuff. It felt a little jerky, but I think part of that was also just our skills as interviewers throughout the process. That, yeah, after now 42 plus episodes, you certainly learn a lot more about how to interview people. For me personally, one of the big learnings was I don't need to take 40 seconds to ask a question, that I can actually just cut straight to the question that I want to ask. So,
or I'll just edit it out.
Yeah, thank God for the edit. But it does teach you to sort of, you can use talking to process thoughts, but also to make sure that the focus is on the guest. Getting those questions out is really important. So that was great for us to develop those skills as interviewers. And I think the other thing on that is Fran and I, throughout the episodes, found it great to have a partner that was there to help, because there were times in the episode where maybe we got a little lost or perhaps didn't quite remember like what the next thing was, but you had someone else that you can tag in for like, can you like, help me out? So it was great for like keeping the flow of episodes going and just keeping that working. We talked a lot about quality being a really important thing. For me, certainly, like Fran started editing a lot of the episodes initially, and I needed to upskill throughout the process once we went external to actually learn how to do all of the editing. And certainly, it takes time to actually get the level of quality that we're aiming for. And as Fran mentioned before, we certainly had some teamwork on actually achieving the end goal. Mostly Fran was doing a lot of the heavy lifting, but it was just really interesting to go through the process of thinking about what does a good quality podcast episode actually look like and sound like, and have to think about that, which then feeds into when you're recording. It's kind of like a flywheel. And yeah, ultimately it was all about just learning how to make a podcast. So really, I guess, good experience to just learn how to make something like that. And for us, the skills that I guess we've learned now, we translate into our workplaces, which is good. Are there any other learnings that I've missed?
No, I think you covered it all. And then, yeah, I guess in terms of challenges, obviously there is a lot more than this, but probably the main ones was customer feedback, man. Like, even in any product role, right? I feel like that is one of the hardest things. And it was for us as well. Like, we, I think, put in a little end note, like, talk to us at the end of the episodes. And it's really hard to get people to give feedback, I suppose, especially when you're sending a podcast out into the ether. There's no, like, we don't have a newsletter or anything to add on. So that was really hard. Occasionally people will come up and be like, I listen, it's really cool. And you're like, okay, tell me more. That's all. And then they're like, there's nothing. So I think that's continuous challenge for sure. Creating a brand, I think Lauchie kind of touched on that. That was actually really hard. I think finding kind of working out where we fit in both, like, New Zealand podcasts or product podcasts. Like, it's really hard to create a brand and understand like what people see in that brand. And so we, for sure, the kind of product journeys is probably the main thing we're going for, like, sort of personal stories. But there's also so much other stuff that we do there as well. So it's again, if anybody wants to come and chat about brand afterwards, keen. The third one, so we talked quite a lot, or like back and forth around whether we wanted to pay for kind of ads or pay for sponsorship, or we haven't yet. It's all organic growth. But we definitely kind of curious around what the possibilities there are. I think the more we talked about it, it's just time, and effort. So I think what we've got to so far is like we've put in kind of, I suppose, expectations of effort required. The next point ties into that, like it takes a lot of time and effort to do it. So I think we put in as much as we had, and then we kind of threw around ideas, but I think every time it was like, well, who's going to do it? How much time is it going to take? Like, how much time have we got? And so, yeah, that was the challenge again with like paid growth is you really have to plan it. You have to think about it, put your own money into it. And I think both of us were just not, well, I definitely wasn't prepared to. But yeah, is there anything else on the challenge?
No, I guess just like the expectations of effort, but at the bottom, like when we were evolving throughout the process, just making sure that we were actually a team throughout it. That certainly Fran throughout the early stages was doing a lot of the heavy lifting. So we had to have a few chats throughout the way to basically help me to make sure that I was actually doing my part. But no, once we got that like established, it was just like the working out like how much we wanted to put into that, because we also had our day jobs, and for me sport, and Fran's got other things outside of work as well. So it's like that dilemma of how much do you want to invest in this really?
Yeah, some hard conversations, but it's good. I feel like that is good practice as well.
Exactly. Yeah. Cool. Rapid fire questions. So as mentioned, we have these on the episodes, but we wanted to do some of these live.
Yeah.
I'm starting, right?
Yeah.
Cool. So Fran, what's one thing you've learned?
Well, so in terms of all the people we've talked to, I think I went in that question at the very beginning, like what's your go-to product framework? I really thought there was a go-to product framework for certain scenarios. I mean, I was new to product, and I've learned that there is not a go-to product framework. Great to know, but it really, there are like certain ones that people brought up more often than others, but it's really about the situation you're in and all the different kind of things to take into consideration. So I think I pretty quickly learned that, but that was fun. Okay, what's one thing that has surprised you from talking to people?
I think for me, just like the variety of backgrounds that people came into product with. Like I myself was an engineer, and I had seen a lot of people transitioning in the tech space to be a product person. But like after chatting to all the guests that we have, like people came in from some very interesting and diverse backgrounds, which you would never like be like, oh yeah, that's the obvious path to get into product. But it was just really fascinating, like talking to all these people, and they're like, wait, you worked at like a cafe before getting into product? We had some people that did that, or like worked at, I don't know, some other. Yeah.
Someone built the highway.
Oh yeah.
Civil engineering.
Yeah.
Now in product. That was really cool.
Yeah. So that was really interesting for me. Fran, what's one thing that's gone wrong?
Well, you touched on it before. I think, there's a couple of things. Firstly, I've definitely had total mind blank moments in recording episodes, which is such an awful feeling. But obviously you can edit it out. But yeah, conversations where I'm about to ask a question and I just couldn't think of it, and it was silent for moments. But probably the really big thing was we definitely, when we were wanting to go externally from Xero, it was really tricky. I don't think we quite realized the kind of system, and yeah, we can talk about it more afterwards, but that was for sure at that point I was like, I don't know if I want to do this anymore. And I'm really glad we found a solution to that, but that was a very difficult kind of point in the podcast. Yeah. All right. What is your biggest, what's your favorite episode and why?
Like, I'll make it up.
I know.
Practice these questions beforehand. So favorite episode for me was one with Lydia Royal, who was someone that I went to engineering school with. So it was one of these beautiful sort of full circle moments that we're now both product people, and just fascinating, both connecting on how do we actually get into product, and like, I guess the things that we learned at university, obviously not necessarily being relevant to what we do, as most university degrees perhaps aren't. But it was also one of these conversations that got me to think a lot about the customer experience, that when you're developing products, like how you should do it well. And the story that Maria told was around thinking about, she worked at a bank at the time, and it was about the journey that a family goes through if someone has recently passed away, and how if you don't actually think about that as a product person, that can be a really shitty experience for people to go through. And when we're designing experiences and products as product people, to actually make sure that we are considering perhaps not just the happy path, but also those other ways that people might use your products, and perhaps being in less fortunate situations and how you can actually design for that. So that for me was a really powerful episode, just to actually open up my mind as a product person. Fran, your biggest takeaway, how has it had an impact on your job?
I think it's come up in so many different episodes, but people's kind of gratefulness to the people that they work with has been one thing that's kind of resonated. And I think, well, I've written down, so I think Alina in episode 25 and Tanya in episode 30 both talked about like actually getting to know the people in your team, and how much of a difference that can make, especially if you come to a difficult kind of situation, or you know they're not pulling their weight or something. And I took that back and like really have like got to know my team members a lot better, and kind of asking them more personal questions, and it's helped. It's just makes a huge difference in terms of like, yeah, when I don't know, we've had a few issues going or things that have happened at Xero in the past year, so that's definitely helped. All right, have you got a book recommendation?
I do. Love to read, but my go-to one at the moment is Never Split the Difference, which I see some nods, is a book by a guy called Chris Voss, which is about hostage negotiation and how to negotiate. But essentially the whole book is around how when you're negotiating with someone, that before you get what you want, you actually really need to understand where the other person is coming from, to understand motivation. So you can get to that common ground and a shared understanding, and then from there you can work to get to the ideal situation. And yeah, this guy did it in some very extreme scenarios, but there's some great bits of advice and learnings in there, and even things around how to do salary negotiation, and how to work with getting promotions as well. So couldn't recommend the book. Fran, podcast recommendation.
Yes,
do you have one?
From this one?
Yeah.
I listen to heaps of podcasts, and it's really hard to pick the ones, but I think recently I've listened to the Ezra Klein show, which is really great. He's a journalist, I think, at the Times, and he just has really interesting topics that I find he deep dives into really well. Fixable is another one. It's just a really interesting, I think, two women who take a problem often in the workplace and then like work through to a solution, which, and they do it really well. And so I find often that I'll be having a similar problem and I'm like, that's a great idea. And then in terms of product, I think Lenny's podcast is probably the one that I listen to the most in that area. So those are my three. All right, am I going? Is it me? Oh yeah, okay. Sneak peek into, so what's next? I guess after a difficult conversation, we basically said we wanted to kind of wrap up season 1, take a step back and work out whether we both were invested enough to go forward with something new. And we've come back from that and we are keen to do a season 2. We've kind of decided that we were rolling through season 1. We're just like, not really thinking about it. And actually on season 2, we're going to have a scope. So we're going to get our selection of people that we want to talk to in advance, and these people are going to be product leaders. So we've stepped up in our career, and so we feel like now we also want to talk to people who are that kind of level higher. And I also think some of the more interesting conversations, or not more interesting, but some of the ones that we enjoyed in terms of like what we were learning was that slightly higher level nearer the end. So I feel like that was that's something that we're interested in. Yeah,
and I guess it just gives us a chance to hopefully deep dive on specific topics as well. Which will be fun. And I guess the goal for season 2, obviously continuing to build the community and the people that listen to our podcast. The primary measure is, as always, going to be listens, and how many people actually listen to the episode. But the other thing that I think is really important to Fran and I is essentially, are we still enjoying this as well, and making sure that we're enjoying it. But also hopefully that even if just 1 or 2 people are getting stuff out of the episodes, then that's a pretty cool thing for us as product people, to be helping other product people with their journeys. So that's kind of the main framing for season 2. I don't think I've missed too much on that, right, Fran?
No.
But obviously there's the question is, does this sound like something you'd want interested in? Which we'll do the show. We've got a few people. Okay, cool. No pressure for that, but obviously we're happy to chat more about this and about the ideas and any of the measures of success. But we wanted to close with these are all the people that have
Some of
been
you
on our podcast. I see a few of you in the room, so thank you for coming. But yeah, that's our talk for now, and wanted to open up the floor if there's any questions. So, thank you.
Is there? Do I go on to the final
Read us
slide?
down now. Oh yeah, listen to us.
Pre questions.
Oh, pre-questions. Okay. Yeah.
Does product journey essentially translate to end user journey of using the product? Not sure about that. Current product. What's your current favorite product and why?
Oh, nice. Do you want to go first?
I mean, I listen to, I think Spotify is my, I love music, I love podcasts. Like I literally, my listening hours last year was like a third of my year. So,
Wow.
You doing
Like it's
No.
accumulated.
yeah. It's fine. So
Is one of them like a sleep track that you play as well?
maybe I listen to podcasts as I go to sleep.
There you go. I would go a thing on my iPad called Procreate, which I just draw pictures and make digital art, which back in the NFT craze got really into selling those online. So ask me about that later. But yeah, Procreate, just a great real like polished tool for specifically creating art on your iPad. So
You have great art.
thank you.
All right. Was there a moment when you felt like packing it in, closing it down? What caused it, and how did you overcome it?
Nice. I guess we touched on the zero thing before, right, Fran? Like that was.
Yeah. What was the bit of like going outside zero that was hard?
Mm.
You said it was hard, but
Well,
what about
okay,
it was
let's-
hard?
Yeah. It's difficult to know how much we can say. That's
It's
the
an above the
challenge.
line answer, which we'll give. But if you want to know more, we'll talk
Okay.
about more details of the camera. But essentially, like when you are building something internally at a company, the taking that externally, there's obviously concerns around like, are you taking a zero brand or an IP externally? Are you sharing things in the episodes that perhaps you shouldn't be? Initially, it was people talking very in-depthly about zero products, which obviously, if you take that outside, then that may be sharing company secrets. So that was one of the things, as we mentioned, we had to re-edit and think about what we were doing.
Yeah, but we did. I mean, we read it and cut out, but actually, it was maybe 2 paragraphs of
Yeah.
20 episodes that we ended up
It was pretty
going out.
general.
So it really wasn't very much. And I think we decided, because there was an option to maybe have kind of zero sponsor us, but then we decided actually it's just too difficult. So we would.
Yeah, and I think it's just that having to jump through, like if we did that, you need to comply with all the rules and do all the stuff. We're like, well, we don't even know if this is like a legit thing that people want
Exactly.
to do yet.
Exactly. We were still an MVP
Yeah.
stage then. And then I think also we weren't interested. What we really wanted to talk about wasn't. It was about product journeys. It wasn't specific to Zero or a company. It was really more about the more general, general stories from people. So I think what we wanted, maybe they didn't understand what the podcast was about as well. So
And I think the only other thing on that was like we mentioned at the end of our season 1, we got to a point where we were just pumping out these episodes and it sort of felt a little bit like a grind, and we started to question, whether we wanted to keep doing that. So they're having the pause that we've done recently to sort of reassess why we're doing it and also just have a little bit of a mental break. But I don't know when we started why we didn't think of an idea of, well, we should just do a season.
Yeah.
Like that would have been really logical. But
no, I mean, we listened to everyone else. So
Yeah, what was
yes.
the number you ended on? Was it a weird number?
It was a medium light. Me too, yeah.
That wasn't
Wasn't
intentional.
intentional. But yeah.
But maybe it came through.
Yeah. So I'd
Yeah.
say those. But any questions?
I have a question. So you mentioned that you had a really big focus on keeping it very Kiwi, very New Zealand, and understanding the market here. Having also a lot of exposure to American podcasts and the conversations, and a lot of our influence in product management comes from America and Europe and stuff. Did you get a flavor for any key differences between how do Kiwis do product versus how does the rest of the world do product, and what are the main things that are different that you noticed?
I have to like drag it out of my memory.
Yeah, we actually talked about that exact thing on our episodes.
That one?
I think. What do you remember? I think culturally, Kiwis are a lot more relaxed in what we do, and I feel like there's probably we haven't had the experience. So people getting into products, it's very early days here, whereas I think in the US, like it's much more advanced. So if you come into like even the government, asking for product, people, I don't think they know what product is or means, and so when they ask for a product, you kind of have to go in and work out if they know what skills you can offer, and then also understanding what skills as a product person you have. So I think that's one thing that I've realized.
Yeah, and I think like even within your question, like it wasn't necessarily just about the New Zealand and the rest of the world, but also like the Silicon Valley bubble as well that happens. That like when you make it outside of that, how you might approach products in the VC venture capital, like hungry, get it out, ship it kind of world, maybe is slightly different. So yeah, I think those are the main kind of differences. But I think also it was just like for us in New Zealand is that weird barrier of we geographically feel quite remote compared to the rest of the world, but in practice with a lot of the tools that we have these days, that's not actually a major barrier for people. So it's like being able to push past that and work out like how can you actually test your things in a global scale rather than just setting yourself at just New Zealand, I guess. I don't know.
I don't know.
We'll get back to you on that.
Yeah.
No, that's good. Thank you. Kim.
Front row.
I'm a bit more time poor than you, orally. Just me podcast. But you did briefly mention a newsletter, and I'm curious. I feel like virtually I can dedicate time to a little quick buy. Is it something that you might test for season 2?
That's a good question. Yeah. I mean, again, we've talked about it. Usually newsletters come first, don't they? And then podcasts come out of them. But I think it's time. Well, it comes down to time. So
I think like nowadays with all those like fancy AI tools that are out there, like pulling transcripts from episodes and stuff, like maybe. What's that? So we won't rule it out, I guess is what I'll say to that. But I think a lot of it for us just comes back to that question of where do we put our limited hours as to the things? And I think once we start doing something like that, if we're not willing to continue doing it, then
maybe we can scope it.
Definitely use AI, and I just like still try before you buy.
Yeah.
You guys do very well.
Thank you. One last thing on that, actually, we did think that that's a really good way to understand who our listeners are, because you then have a little bit more information about them. So that would be a really good. Yeah.
And I think like not directly related to your question, but like as Fran mentioned, we have a bunch of ideas of things we could do like at the start. And we do have a website that exists. It's on the free version of Canva, but it's a website. But like one of those ideas of like, creating resources from all the great things that our speakers have talked about and learned and shared. Again, like it could be great to do that. And we probably will, but I think it's one of those. So we need to find the time or pay someone to do it. So. I know, yes, all right. That's all right. John. There was a question here first.
So I really love the way that you framed this around the problem that you're solving. Clearly also including yourself in the audience of like solving this problem. My question then is, how much time does it actually take? And are your employers supportive of that, or are you doing this outside of your work schedule?
Each episode takes about this much. I mean, I like when we first started, like this was just part of our community of practice that I think we were allowed personal development time as part of like our work. I think that's what that was factored on. So that was a thing that we did. I guess the question is, as that grew, I'll be honest, like a lot of it comes out of outside of work time and hours that we stay up at night editing episodes and things like that. That's just what you have to do because as product people know, you often have very busy days, so carving out, you know, multiple hours of focus time to edit things is quite difficult. But yeah, as far as like the support from our immediate bosses, it was really positive, both at Xero for me previously, but also with my current boss now. So that's my experience. But Fran,
What in terms of, yeah, I mean, I think the editing was definitely the hardest part.
no, just we forgot the whole recruiting part of this as well. That's another part of the pipeline that takes time as well. That it's not just getting people on a Google Meet, but it's getting the right guests in and doing. We've got a brief that we send out to people, and all of these other steps as well that go into before you even get off the start line.
And initially, we had someone helping who was also part of the community of practice doing the recruiting, which was awesome. And then she had too much going on and bowed out. So then, yeah, I think like that addition of things kind of over time definitely takes
So
its
you feel
toll.
like you're getting a good return on your time investment?
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, I mean, so we do every 2 weeks. So this is within 2 weeks. It's
Good question.
and all the other stuff.
So are you planning to scale your 2-person team to get to?
We talked about that once, right?
more-
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like you've got
Yeah.
a good product going. You've got a lot of ideas. It's clearly takes a lot of time. So
Yeah, I think like one of the things when we talked about that initially is like the quality pillar at the start being quite important. That I think given the fact that it does take time bringing someone else in before we're completely confident the fact that, you know, either they're buying on their own time or that we could do the thing of paying for them. We're not quite at that point yet, but I think it was also just that, yeah, if we bring someone in, what if they don't agree with how we want to run it, and, you know, those tensions. But
Yeah.
I don't know if you've got-
And also time. I mean, it takes time to train people to, you know, make sure, I guess if things go wrong, that's also, I think the time factor is the main thing that we haven't done it up until now. And nobody's come and been like, I'm really keen to help you out to do this as well. And it does, I don't think behind the scenes is not that obvious when you just listen to something. So I think kind of working through what that would look like would be part of it. So yeah, it's an option. But
Yeah, and I guess the other thing is like it is still relatively early days. Like 42 episodes is like a lot-ish, but like compared to some of the other podcasts out there, like they've been going for a while.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things I guess I've picked up is like it does take a while for like, you know, to hit your break of like making it big and getting a lot of listeners and stuff. So it's like maybe we just have to keep doing this pretty bare like bootstraps for now, and then we can look at expanding later. But yeah, there's a question over here.
Yeah, I was just wondering, you talk a lot about like, it's your role versus your role. How do you balance kind of divide and conquer, because you've got super limited time, but also how do you get those strategy sessions where you're actually working through a really good idea and actually challenging each other? Because it's hard to find that balance. So do you have any advice for that?
we do. So we have a weekly sync every week, half an hour. So that's when we just go like, what are we each doing? Go away with actions. But I think, yeah, I guess approached Lauchie with a difficult or like a crucial conversation where I was like, hey, this is not working for me. I'm doing it all and I really need you to step up. And I think that was the beginning of us being like, okay, how do we make it fair? And so we decided that we would each take a person through the whole end-to-end flow. So you'd recruit them, you'd organize everything, you do all the editing, you do all the the posting or the publishing. And that seemed to work pretty well. And so it just requires us having a kind of a fair, or like that we were both recruiting the same amount of people.
Yeah.
But that means that we both have the skills to do everything as well.
Yeah.
And
I think there's still like the quality control part of the process as well, that like we'd still listen to each other's episodes before they actually went live, just to make sure that, you know, there wasn't something that we either missed or that, you know, wasn't quite up to the standard that it needed to be.
or just different years are really
Yeah,
helpful. Yeah.
you pick up on things. So yeah, I think that's essentially how I'm so used to living on like, you know, the meat life. It's like the order of hands, so I know who's
There's one over there.
right. Let's play over here.
Have you found an ecosystem of other podcasters around either New Zealand or internationally, and how do you balance the learnings of successful scaled podcasts with the feedback from customers and your own intentions for the podcast?
Yeah, good. Do you want to talk about the Getting to That Podcast expert guide that we did?
Yeah.
We like early in our, I guess, going external journey, we chatted to, I think it was just through someone who was making another podcast on behalf of Xero that we talked to, where they basically just talked about how to make a podcast and even things like the listener numbers that it's a great webpage actually, but the listener numbers that we're hitting like puts us in like, I think it was like the top 20% of like podcasts that are like based on how many people are actually listening and stuff. So like even just learning what the level is that you're trying to hit was really interesting. I guess engaging with other people that do podcasting, if I'm honest, we haven't really done that.
I think I've messaged a few, no reply.
yeah, that's actually true. Yeah, like and I guess particularly like
So-
we'd reached out to a few other podcasters to talk about their podcasts and things, but that's going to be too popular to get back to us. But yeah, I think it's one of those ones that for us growing it, it's probably a really useful thing to lean into that space as well. And we did actually have a chat to Richard, who was a former broadcaster, I think, who did things in the radio space that gave us some great tips as well. But I think ironically this all comes back to the time, and instead of coming to meetups like this, maybe we should go to podcast meetups. I'm going to go in front of Turks and then I'll come to you next.
Do you have a return on investment? It's just about learning and enriching yourself, scale what you make money in a podcast, it's the networking exercise. Why would I repeat that question?
Okay, just a +1 on that. So the question was, do we have a return on investment in mind with the podcast? Like what we're looking to get out of it essentially for the time that we're putting in. But Fran, do you want to try that one first?
I think we mentioned it a little bit around, I think initially we had quite high hopes, potentially, maybe like different hopes. I don't think we talked about it very much at the beginning actually, but I think, actually what we learned along the way was huge and sort of, I can really enjoy talking to people. So it's kind of an excuse to talk to people and learn also for me, but then being able to share that with other people and pass on those learnings, I think is pretty key.
Yeah.
But in terms of growing, not particularly, it's really hard, I think, to grow. So it's one of those things where it's maybe we just don't have enough time to invest in it to be able to go to that next level.
Yeah, and I think for me, it's one of those things as a product person generally, carving out time within your day for personal development and actually investing in your own career is often something that's really difficult. So we've found a fun hack that we actually get to spend an hour chatting to someone who knows a lot about products, and we can just ask honestly the questions that are on my mind when they're talking about stuff. So from that perspective, it's a great payoff. But yeah, as far as the monetization and all that stuff, there's conversations around we could get sponsored and we could try and put ads on our podcasts and things. But if I'm honest, it's not really about that for us. It's more about helping people grow in their product careers. And if at some point we could do this full time or something, maybe cool.
We haven't talked about that.
Yeah, but I guess for me, I also really like my job as a product person as well. So it's I don't know, I would find it hard to go all into the point that it's we're making millions off this podcast. But I don't know. Hopefully that answers your question. Did you have a question, Tokes?
I did, yeah.
Let's go.
I wanted to know a little bit about your process for ensuring quality of the content, which is everything, right? Not just the editor, but you can't just invite someone and just poke it there and put it in storyteller, right? Do you talk with the guests before they go online and get the guidance? Do you transcript it? Do you research them so that you know more about them and about themselves?
I guess the short answer is we evolved that process throughout the time. I think initially, if I'm honest, we were just stoked that people wanted to come on and talk to us. But I think throughout, we evolved, especially things like having good microphones on the call, just from that perspective. We noticed when people didn't have good mics, the listening back to the audio was that's not quite what we wanted. I think a lot of it, for us, just came back to were we proud or stoked of the product that we were putting out? But I guess, do you want to talk about the recruiting people and the experience of?
Yeah, we actually asked, so the way mostly that we recruited is we asked the person that we were talking to if they recommended somebody else. So that was an easy sort of way for us to get connections and to learn about people who'd be interesting to talk to. I think one realization I had is that sometimes like good presenters are not very good on podcasts, which was quite fascinating. So we had some recommendations of people who they're amazing and they have great ideas and they're really good at presenting. And then we talked to them and it just didn't flow as well. So that was really interesting. That was during the conversation with them.
Yeah, but like to be fair, like all the conversations we had were good. It's just the like some things like the energy that's brought to the episode and stuff. Sometimes we can be really high energy and the person is perhaps not matching that, so we need to adjust our style. And I think the other thing as well is probably not underselling like the amount that editing can actually play in the final product that goes out there. That we had an hour's worth of talking beforehand, which we then cut down to 30 minutes. So even if there's not like the most compelling story the whole time, like we can cut it down to produce a pretty good product at the end. But yeah, I think that's probably one of our lessons going into season 2 is just how can we, both for us as people making the podcast, but also for our guests, how can we get them up to speed of sort of what we're expecting, like what things we want to know, and just get them comfortable with us as people first, before some of them we literally just met on the Zoom call like before the thing. We're like, hi, all right, you ready? Let's go.
The other thing is that we talk to people who don't have a profile online, so there's not actually much to research, and you just go into a conversation, and it's the kind of beauty of leading it, finding what's interesting. So a lot of they were just sort of group product managers or something that aren't known in the product world. So that was something that we kind of went in knowing.
I want to just piggybacking on that in terms of like vetting them and figuring out quality content. But the way that I interpret that question was about like, you're passing on advice to the product world, right? Mm. Do you ever sometimes feel like you need to vet that advice because it's maybe missing the bar of best practice, or actually not quite aligned with where we actually want the community to go? And
Interesting.
How do you manage that while respecting the guest? Like there's a lot of really controversial opinions in product, and there's a lot of like takes where people just like really fiercely disagree about things.
Yeah.
I suppose it's no, we haven't really thought about it like that, and probably what the idea is to kind of share that and kind of bring it, open up that can of worms. I don't know, like just acknowledge that there are a lot of different opinions. I don't think that either of us have a very strong view of what we think is right or wrong, or what should or shouldn't be. And so it's maybe opening up the conversation.
Like even throughout, as Fran mentioned, like the thing around frameworks, right? Like even if we had ideas from chatting to different people, it actually challenged the way that we thought about stuff. And I think for me, the beauty of having a conversation with people about product is you can really lean into that, and you're like, oh, that's interesting. Like another guest talked about this in this way. Like, how do you feel about that? And like, contrast stuff and sort of trying to get the layers deep on things, because as we all know in product, it's most of the time it depends is a perfectly legitimate answer. So yeah,
leaning in with curiosity, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly.
For sure.
So yeah, I've lost
One
track.
more question.
All right, one more question. Who wants it? Right in the middle. Yeah, yours.
So making the assumption that through this process you've also developed your own practices, what would you say are some of the key ways that you've changed how you manage your product roles through what you've learned?
It's one of those things that there's just been so many throughout the times that I think some of it like we iterate and try, but I think like one of the big themes to me that always comes up is just around communication and making sure that you're doing that in a way that's building understanding, but also empathizing with them around where they're coming from, and just actually approaching all of the conversations to get a shared understanding, as opposed to just trying to railroad things or be like, no, this is the way that it must go. So I think that for me was like important, just to make sure that we are thinking about more than just the immediate bit of work, but the whole conversation and context around things. There's a bunch of like fun little tidbits that we've had as well, of like little frameworks and stuff, but off the top of my head, it's now just part of my product work.
I think it fast-tracked my product development, and I'm trying to pick like what it was. I think just the whole diverse conversations with people and challenging what I thought. Like I said, I went in with this idea that there was a framework. I mean, that's one example of many different assumptions I think I had, and so I think I've come away, yeah, especially listening back. I went through when we did our reflections at the very end, like listened back over all the episodes and kind of wrote my takeaways or the things that stood out. And that was really fascinating to kind of realize that I'd taken a lot of that with me and like applied it in my own product role as well. And that was quite cool to kind of reflect on that. I hadn't realized that until I did that exercise.
Do you want to jump back to the previous slides where they see the QR code and everyone else? always got to sell here. And the other thing that jumped to my mind as well is we had, I think the first person that talked about it was Liam O'Neill, but the importance of chatting to the money side of your business, like the accountancy departments, and actually understanding the commercials behind a lot of products. That I think when a lot of product people first start, it's about understanding a problem space and then shipping something out and like validating whether it's actually solved the problem. But when you actually take it out to that business context, there's so many more things that matter. And I guess also just boiling back to, as a business, what are the key things that you actually care about? And I think for me, it's just a lot of the episodes that we've had have just planted the seeds for things that I'm like, oh, I should actually go ask some people about that, and just encouraging me to build a better product context around the things that I'm doing and why I'm doing them. So that would be it. But yeah, Fran mentioned we've got an episode towards the end around reflections, so feel free to jump in. There's plenty more in there. But I think that's it.
Yeah, that's that. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming along. We have some pieces that we can tuck into. Yeah, just a huge thank you to the both of you for the gift that you have given to the product world. And it's amazing what you've done. And I've loved hearing everyone's stories.
Also, shout out to people who've been on. Yeah, there's a few of you out there who've so we also really appreciate everyone who's been a guest and chatted to us for an hour.
Yeah.
Cool.
Cool.
All right.